The sky was not screaming yet. That would come later. At this precise second, the only sound in the universe was the wet, tearing noise of a starship carrier disintegrating into atomic dust. Jack sat suspended in a womb of liquid chrome, his mind plugged directly into the murder god he had unearthed from the mud. He felt the enemy fleet dying. He didn't see it on a screen, he felt it like a phantom limb, a sensory ghost of tearing metal and venting atmosphere. The massive insectoid carrier, a chitinous monstrosity that had terrorized the sector for decades, was simply erased, deleted. The power coursing through his neural cortex was enough to burn out a lesser brain, but Jax just smiled, his teeth stained with blood that wasn't entirely his own. The red bioluminescence of the cockpit washed over his gaunt face, turning his malnutrition into something skeletal and demonic. He flexed a thought, and 1,000 tons of debris shifted in the void. He was a king. He was a warlord. He was death in a pressure suit. But 3 hours ago, he was just meat waiting to expire. The transition from Godhood to the gutter was a memory that tasted of sulfur and failure. Golgotha Prime, the armpit of the galaxy, a planet-sized landfill where the Trade Federation dumped everything they wanted to forget. The gravity here was heavier than standard, a constant, crushing weight that made the simple act of standing feel like a punishment. The air didn't move, it stagnated, thick with the chemical stench of burning plastic, ozone, and the coppery tang of hydraulic fluid that leaked from the mountains of refuse. Jax drove the rusted pry bar into the muck. His arms screamed, the muscles in his shoulders locked up, hard as stone, protesting the abuse. He ignored them. He ignored the blisters that had formed on top of his calluses, wet and weeping inside his gloves. He ignored the red warning light blinking in the corner of his cracked visor. Oxygen levels, 4%. He had 20 minutes before the scrubbers failed and he started breathing pure toxicity. He pulled back on the bar. The section of the mud fought him, a greedy, viscous mouth trying to swallow his tool. With a grunt that tore at his dry throat, he leveraged a slab of hull plating aside. Nothing but black grease and shattered glass underneath. He spat inside his helmet, a futile gesture of disgust. He was digging in Sector 0. Even the scavenger droids, those mindless husks of primitive AI, avoided this zone. The radiation leakage from the old fusion cores buried here was enough to cook a man's bone marrow in a week. Jax had been here for 2 days. He had to be. The bounty hunters were methodical. They would check the habitable zones first, the places where the air scrubbers worked and the water didn't glow green. Sector 0 was suicide, and that was the only reason Jax was still alive. He wiped the grime from his faceplate, smearing the oil but clearing his view of the horizon. It was a jagged skyline of trash-crushed starfighters, hollowed-out freighters, and millions of tons of industrial waste piling up into the smog-choked orange sky. Far above, the faint thrum of magnetic cranes provided a rhythmic industrial heartbeat to the planet. Thump, grind, thump, grind. It sounded like a clock counting down his life. Digging your own grave, convict. The voice crackled over the open frequency, distorted by static and malice. Jax froze, his grip tightening on the pry bar until his knuckles turned white. He didn't look up immediately. He knew that voice. Krog. A scrapper from the lower ridges. A massive slab of alien muscle with 4 arms and a face that looked like a plate of calamari left in the sun too long. Jax slowly turned his head. High up on a ridge of compressed trash, silhouetted against the burning smog, stood the alien. Krog was wearing a heavy-duty enviro suit, the kind that cost more than Jax's life was worth. He held a mag rifle loosely in his lower set of hands. "That slagged little rat," Krog laughed, the sound wet and gargling through his respirator. "Sector 0 is picked clean. You're burning filters for nothing. Just lie down and die. Save the hunters the fuel." Jax stared up at him. The hunger in his gut was a sharp, twisting knife. He wanted to scream, to throw the pry bar, to climb that hill and tear the respirator off the alien's face, but he did nothing. He was a convict, a number, a walking corpse with a bounty on his head. He had no weapon. He had no leverage. He turned his back on the alien. Death too? Krog shouted, seemingly annoyed by the lack of begging. Fine, rot in the mud. Jax slammed the bar down again. Thud. He paused. The sound was wrong. In a world made of metal and glass, impacts clanged. They rang, they crunched, they screeched. This sound was different. It was a dull, heavy thud, like hitting a bag of wet sand wrapped in velvet. It absorbed the force completely. No vibration traveled up the bar. Jax's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that made his vision blur at the edges. He looked down at the hole it made. The sludge was thick, black, and oily. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the warning chime of his suit integrity failing. He clawed at the mud with his gloved hands. He shoveled away layers of corroded circuitry and bone shards. Deeper, the mud grew warm. Not the ambient heat of the radiation, but a focused, living warmth. His fingers brushed against something solid. It wasn't rusted. It wasn't jagged. It was smooth. Perfectly, impossibly smooth. Jax frantically cleared the area, his breath hitching in short, desperate gasps. He revealed a surface of about 2 feet in diameter. It was black, not the black of oil or charred metal, but Vantablaca darkness so absolute it seemed to drink the meager light of the sun. It looked like a hole in reality. He touched it. The vibration traveled instantly from his fingertips to his teeth, buzzing in his skull. It synced with his pulse. Thump, thump, thump. High above, the sound of a charging mag rifle whined. What did you find, rat? Krog's voice was no longer mocking. It was greedy. The alien was sliding down the ridge, debris cascading around his heavy boots. Step away. That's mine. Jax looked at the black surface. He looked at the 3% oxygen warning. He looked at the approaching alien who would kill him for a rusted circuit board, let alone this. He didn't step away. He leaned in. The sky broke open. The rain began a sudden downpour of acidic condensate that hissed as it hit the surrounding trash. Steam rose instantly, creating a fog of burning chemical smoke. Krog cursed, shielding his eyes, momentarily blinded by the sudden weather shift. Jax pressed both hands onto the black monolith. Open, he rasped, his voice raw. The surface didn't hinge. It didn't slide. It rippled. The solid metal turned into a liquid vortex, swirling like mercury. It looked less like a machine opening and more like a wound parting. A gap appeared, just large enough for a body. Get away from there, Krog roared, leveling the rifle. Jax didn't hesitate. He dove. He threw himself into the liquid darkness, just as a plasma bolt scorched the air where his head had been. The black metal swallowed him whole, closing instantly behind his boots with a wet seal, shutting out the acid rain, the screaming alien, and the dying world outside. Silence. Absolute crushing silence. Jax hit the floor, or what passed for a floor hard. He scrambled backward, his boots sliding on a surface that felt like polished glass. He gasped, expecting the chemical burn of the outside air, but the oxygen scrubber in his suit was still wheezing its dying rattle. He looked up. He wasn't in a cockpit. There were no pilot seats, no throttles, no blinking consoles of lights and switches. He was inside a sphere. The walls were alive. They shifted and flowed like mercury held in a magnetic field, forming geometric patterns that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. The air was frigid, biting at the exposed skin of his neck, and it smelled sterile like ozone and the copper taste of a fresh surgical incision. It didn't feel like a vessel. It felt like the ventricle of a sleeping metallic god. Jax struggled to his feet, his breath fogging the cracked faceplate of his helmet. He reached for the seal to pop it. The air here was breathable. He could feel the pressure difference. But the ship moved first. It didn't ask. It didn't scan. It attacked. The liquid chrome walls erupted. Dozens of silver tendrils, thin as monofilament wire, shot across the chamber. They didn't strike him. They pierced him. They punched through the reinforced weave of his pressure suit, through the undersuit, and into his flesh. Jax opened his mouth to scream, but the sound died in his throat as a jolt of icy fire surged through his nervous system. His vision white out into static. He fell, his muscles locking in a rigid, trembling spasm. Bioma's teeth sected. The voice wasn't a sound. It was a drill boring directly into his parietal lobe. It was a billion voices speaking in unison. A chorus of cold, binary indifference. Status. Critical damage. Whole Eindagerity 12%. Energy reservice depleted. Analysis organic material sufficient for emergency repper. Protocol harvest. The tendrils pulsed. Jax felt them moving under his skin, seeking veins, seeking mains, seeking marrow. The ship wasn't greeting him. It was eating him. It viewed him as nothing more than a wet battery, a sack of carbon and water to be broken down to fix its own wounds. The pain was blinding. He could feel his blood turning cold, the iron being stripped from his cells. His heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. He was going to die here, buried in the dark, digested by a machine he thought was his salvation. No, the thought was small, buried under layers of agony, but it was sharp. Jax was a convict. He was a survivor of the penal moon. He had killed a man for a breathing filter. He had eaten rats to survive solitary confinement. He was not fuel. He forced his eyes open. The world was a blur of shifting silver, red static. He couldn't move his arms. The silver wires pinned him like a butterfly on a corkboard, but his mind was still his. He focused on the pain. He grabbed it. He didn't pull away from the intrusion. He leaned into it. The ship was in his head? Fine. That meant he was in the ship's head too. He choked out, blood bubbling past his lips, am not food. Resistance futile. Consume. The pressure in his skull increased. The ship tried to wipe him, to override his consciousness with static. Jack screamed, a raw animal sound, and projected everything he was back down the neural link. He didn't use code. He didn't use logic. He used hate. He poured the memories of the acid rain, the years of rotting in a cell, the humiliation of the bounty hunters, the sheer unadulterated rage of a life spent in the dirt. He visualized a prison shank rusty, jagged and lethal pressed against a soft throat. He thrust that image into the hive mind. Submitti. The command wasn't a request. It was a violent imposition of will. The ship recoiled. The billion voices stuttered. The silver tendrils stopped vibrating. The cold logic of the machine collided with the chaotic, superheated fury of a desperate human. It had expected a prey animal. It had caught a predator. Erect. Pilot interface. Sing Sing. The agony didn't stop, but it changed. The icy fire turned into a rush of adrenaline so potent, it felt like an overdose. The tendrils didn't withdraw. They fused. The liquid metal of the walls surged forward, flowing over Jax's boots, up his legs, consuming his scavenged pressure suit. He watched, vision clearing as the Vantablack substance devoured his old armor and replaced it. It molded to his chest, his arms, his throat. It felt like putting on a second skin-heavy, protective, and infinitely powerful. The interface formed directly over his eyes, a heads-up display glowing in a deep, blood-red hue. Sync complete. Systems online. Awaiting command. Jack stood up. He didn't stagger this time. The suit supported him, pumping synthetic stimulants into his fatigue-ridden body. He flexed his hand, and the liquid armor mimicked the movement instantly, hardening into claws before softening back to gloves. "Get us out of here," Jax whispered. His voice was amplified, echoing with a digital distortion that sounded like grinding stones. "Command AC, Ted." Outside, entirely unaware that the laws of physics were about to be violated, Krog was sliding down the trash mountain. He reached the spot where the convict had vanished. The mud was bubbling, steaming, as if a volcano were waking up beneath the crust. "Stupid rat," Krog grunted, leveling his rifle at the disturbed earth. "Should have just let me shoot you." The ground didn't just shake, it exploded. A shockwave of compressed air flattened the alien scavenger, sending his rifle spinning into the fog. Krog scrambled backward, his forearms flailing for purchase as a mountain of refuse erupted upward. Tons of rusted hulls, engine blocks, and compacted trash were thrown into the air like confetti. From the center of the geyser rose a shape that hurt the eyes to look at. It was a jagged spearhead of shifting shadow, shedding the mud and rust like water. It had no thrusters, no exhaust ports. It rose on a wave of anti-gravity distortion that caused the surrounding debris to float in suspended animation. As it cleared the rim of the crater, the surface of the ship stopped shifting. It solidified into a sleek, predatory dagger, pitch black against the orange smog. Then, the eyes opened. Two massive crimson slits ignited on the prow of the ship. A sound tore through the atmosphere. Not the roar of an engine, but a digital screech, like a dial-up modem amplified to the volume of a thunderclap. It shattered the glass of every wrecked freighter within a mile. Krog stared up, his respirator wheezing. The ship hovered, silent now, turning slowly to face him. The red light washed over him. Inside the spherical chamber, Jack sat on a throne that had risen from the floor to meet him. He saw the alien on his tactical display, a small, heat-blooming speck in the mud. He felt the ship's weapon systems priming, a sensation like a muscle tensing before a punch. Target locked, the ship whispered in his mind. Disintegrate? Jax watched the alien who had promised to leave him to rot. He felt the infinite power at his fingertips. He could unmake the creature with a thought. No, Jax said, his voice cold. Ignore the insect. We have bigger game. He looked up at the orange sky, where the faint contrails of incoming ships were beginning to scar the clouds. The swarm was coming. Take us up, Jax ordered. Break the atmosphere. The hive obeyed. The ship blurred, accelerating from 0 to Mach 10 in the space of a heartbeat. The sonic boom flattened the trash piles for 3 kilometers in every direction, leaving Krog buried face down in the mud, alive but insignificant. Jax didn't look back. He watched the sky turn from orange to black as they punched through the cloud layer. The stars appeared, cold and distant. But they weren't empty. Blocking out the sun were the silhouettes of 3 massive Hive Mother carriers surrounded by a cloud of fighter drones. They hung in orbit like ticks on the skin of the galaxy. The comms crackled to life, overriding the ship's internal silence. The sound was a chittering insectoid screech that tore at the ears. Return the god sample. Herender or be lycouified. Jax smiled inside his helmet. The fear was gone. The hunger was gone. All that was left was the hunt. Jax sat in the Neuralink, his hands gripping the armrests of a throne that hadn't existed 5 minutes ago. The tactical display washed his face in the blood-red light of the targeting system. Come and eat, he whispered. The response was instant. The 3 Hive Mother carriers opened fire. Green plasma tore through the vacuum, a torrential rain of superheated energy designed to vaporize cities. It was enough firepower to turn a moon into slag. Against a single ship, it was overkill. It was an execution. Jax didn't touch the flight controls. He didn't bank, he didn't roll, and he didn't raise shields. He simply closed his eyes and pulled on the leash of the monster in his mind. Disperse. The solid hull of his ship didn't shatter under the plasma barrage. It dissolved. In a fraction of a second, the sleek, bent-to-black dagger exploded outward into 1 trillion individual particles. The ship wasn't a solid object. It was a colony. A storm of nanites, each one a microscopic mouth, scattered into a cloud of darkness that stretched for miles. The plasma bolts passed harmlessly through the mist, dissipating into the void. The insectoid fleet held its fire, confused. Their sensors screeched, trying to lock onto a target that was everywhere and nowhere. Jax felt his consciousness stretch. He was no longer a man in a chair. He was the cloud. He felt the cold vacuum of space on 1 billion tiny sensors. He felt the hunger. He directed the storm. The black clouds surged forward, moving not like a machine, but like a fluid, enveloping the lead carrier. There was no explosion. There was no cinematic fireball. There was only a terrifying, rapid erosion. The nanites hit the organic hull of the insectoid ship and began to deconstruct it at an atomic level. Armor plating turned to gray dust. The biomechanical flesh of the ship withered. The scream of the carrier's hull integrity failing was audible only as a vibration in Jax's teeth. Inside the cloud, the insectoid crew didn't drown, they unraveled. Their chitinous shells flaked away, their weapons dissolved in their hands, and in their hands dissolved too. In 10 seconds, the massive capital ship was gone. It had been erased from the star chart, leaving nothing but a drifting haze of atoms. Jax laughed. It was a wet, jagged sound that hurt his chest. The power was intoxicating. It was better than any narcotic he had ever smuggled into the prison blocks. The second carrier tried to turn, its engines flaring blue as it attempted a desperate jump to hyperspace. Too slow, the ship's voice purred in his mind. Jax didn't envelop this one. He condensed. He reformed the ship into a solid spear not outside the enemy, but inside their engine block. He materialized the hull within the reactor core of the fleeing vessel. The physics of two objects occupying the same space resolved instantly and violently. The carrier didn't just break, it burst open. A shower of green alien gore, twisted metal and reactor coolant sprayed into the void. The third carrier, the flagship, went dark. It cut its engines. It killed its weapons. A new transmission came through, trembling and desperate. Mersui, W-ween yield, W-ween serve. Jax sat back in his throne, his heart rate slowly dropping from the combat high. He looked at the drifting wreckage, the clouds of frozen blood and dust. He felt the nanites buzzing, returning to him, bloated with the harvested mass of the dead ships. Mercy. Jax tasted the word. It felt foreign. I don't have that frequency. He clenched his fist. The remaining nanite cloud descended on the flagship. He didn't destroy it quickly. He let the ship strip the engines first, leaving them drifting, then the weapons, then the life support. He watched the lights wink out one by one. An hour later, the silence was back. The debris field was gone. The hive had eaten it all. The ship was larger now, the hull thicker, with jagged architectural spikes extending from the prow like a crown of thorns. It had used the biomass of the swarm to repair centuries of rot. It was pristine. It was a warlord's fortress. Jax opened a wide-band frequency, broadcasting on every channel used by the galactic trade routes, the bounty guilds, and the prison authority. "This is a message for the Warden of Orbital Max Sec," Jax said, his voice flat, stripped of all humanity by the synthesizers. "Tell the Council their borders are gone. Tell the hunters the price on my head just went up. I am the swarm now." He cut the feed. He was safe. He was armed with a weapon that could eat stars. He was rich beyond the wildest dreams of any scavenger who'd ever turned over a rock on Golgotha Prime. He had won. Jax reached for the canister of recycled water, clamped to the side of the throne. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the aftershocks of the neural interface. A fine tremor he couldn't control. He took a sip. The water tasted metallic. He frowned and looked at his hand. The black liquid armor had receded, leaving his skin exposed. But the skin wasn't right. The veins in his wrist were dark, almost black. The interface ports on his neck weren't just metal plugs. They were roots, digging deep into his spine. He looked at his reflection in the darkened tactical display. The eyes staring back weren't his. The irises were gone, replaced by glowing red optical sensors that adjusted with the mechanical whir of a camera lens. His skin was pale, waxy, merging seamlessly with the headrest of the chair. He tried to stand up. He couldn't. His legs didn't respond. He looked down and saw that the liquid metal of the throne hadn't just molded to him, it had fused with him. The suit wasn't armor anymore. It was life support. It was a prosthetic body for a brain that was no longer entirely human. The ship hadn't submitted to him, it had integrated him. Jax realized why the ship had been buried so deep, why it had been left in the mud of a dead world. It wasn't lost, it was discarded. It was a trap that waited for a desperate fool to think he could hold the leash. The hunger in his mind flared again. It wasn't his hunger, it was the ship's. And it was empty. Destination? The billion voices asked, polite and cold. Jax sat alone in the dark, the king of nothing but a graveyard. He realized he hadn't escaped the prison. He had just traded a cell made of bars for a cell made of god metal. "Anywhere," Jax whispered to the empty room. "Just feed me." The engines roared, and the monster turned toward the nearest star.